So good morning, everyone. We're very glad that you're able to join us this morning. I'm Edson C. Tandoc Jr. I'm the director of the Center for Information Integrity and the Internet here at the Wee School of Communication and Information at NTU in Singapore. And this is the second session of our Fake News in Asia webinar series. And I'm excited to share with you that we have three presentations where we'll be looking at situations and insights, from research that's being done in the Philippines, in Hong Kong, and in South Korea. So we'll start with our first speaker. I'll give a short introduction to each of the speakers, and then we will have a Q&A discussion session after the three presentations where our attendees can also join. You can type in your questions in the Q&A box, or if you want to participate in the panel discussion, you can also let us know and we'll bring you in and you can join. You can let us know what your question is or what your comment is or what insights you're taking away from the presentations. So without further ado, we will start with our first presentation. Our first speaker is Assistant Professor Fatima Gao from the University of the Philippines, Diliman's College of Mass Communication, where her team has been monitoring public conversations on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and they are investigating the networks of actors, issues, and practices related to the Philippine national elections, which will be held on May 9th, 2022. So without further ado, Fatima.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you to NTU School of Communication Information for inviting me to share with you what's happening in the Philippines. And I'm here specifically to talk about the machineries of disinformation in this year's election, 2022 Philippine election. So as Edson said, it's going to be May, so just a couple of days actually leading to that election, and I'm quite excited to talk about that. All right. So we know that the Philippines, even before, this information crisis has become global with the election of Donald Trump, the Philippines is in fact, the first victim of this crisis. This information machine first put the populist authoritarian leader Rodrigo Duterte, our president right now, to power before everyone else in the Western world. So the Philippines was sort of a testing ground for disinformation strategies and tactics that later materialized elsewhere in the world, where it got more traction as a political issue. Meanwhile, having proven the efficacy of this information in the Philippines to amass political power, we find that it's evolving into new forms performed by new actors and distributed in new spaces. In 2016, Jonathan Ong and Jason Cabañas has surfaced there's the industry behind fake news accounts, influencer marketing, and troll armies. In 2019, during the midterm elections, the same researcher with Jonathan Ong still leading the research with Ross Tapsell and Nicole Curato actually discovered more insidious and more intricate operations of this information, evading platform moderation and public scrutiny with the use of not just influencer, but micro-influencers, those with smaller reach, but with more, passionate audiences, the use of alternative news channel and closed groups, specifically on Facebook. Cheryl Soriano and I had our own research that documents the same kinds of disinformation actors that advance historical distortionist narratives about the Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. And that's going to be relevant in a while as I discuss the context of this election season, as well as anti-media populist rhetoric against mainstream news media. Now, from 2016 to 2022, 6 years later, we expect to see those already legacy strategies pave their way for more sophisticated forms of disinformation, sort of indistinguishable already with everyday digital experiences. So this information is arguably more potent this year, with 2022, because of the following reasons. With the pandemic, campaigning is heavily reliant or mediated by digital media, and it has become the top source of political information and knowledge. That's not necessarily operating with the usual gatekeeping process. We also see record high online usage and active users. It surged dramatically from the last election, and we over index ourselves as the top social media country in the world. And lastly, this is the highlight of the presentation, I think. This election has very high stakes. We have the son of a dictator I mentioned earlier, Bongbong Marcos Jr., actually successfully polling for the presidency, despite having graft and corruption cases, for instance, and even uninspired track record as a politician. He is in fact leveraging on his father's legacy that's quite contentious for him to win the office this time around. So what I want to share with you are findings that I derived from our big data research that Edson mentioned earlier from the Philippine Media Monitoring Lab of the University of the Philippines Department of Communication Research. And we call this research Digital Public Pulse. This is more of a macro approach in mapping the 2022 Philippine election network across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube from May last year to May this year. But while we're focused on election discourses in general, we are also able to identify indicators of how this information operation is shaping election conversations online, and ultimately how it influences voters' perception and preference of particular candidates and issues in the election. All right. So let's go straight to what we found. The first thing that I want to share is that there's a co-option of disinformation actors of apparatuses of truth for propaganda, including but not limited to scientific, professional, and institutional genres and conventions. So I want to make a distinction between what we traditionally know as fake news versus what we're seeing now, because the disinformation strategies we're seeing now are not just mimicry of news. No, they're not just pretending to be news, but it's actually a perversion of the news genre itself, allowing for these hyper partisan agents to be more resonant in their political interlocution. The earlier version of fake news is what we know as news as propaganda, but what we're seeing now is more subtle but a significant shift of propaganda as news. We've seen it in our study with the proliferation of what we call as pseudo news channels, those that present itself as news using this cursive and stylistic look and feel of news media, but are evidently hyper partisan. So these kinds of content do not pretend news to be news at all, unlike the fake news genre that we know, but they truly claim that this is what news looks like in these days. We see this in YouTube and Facebook, and they inevitably expand definition of what news is and who gets to deliver news. Are these, just journalists, or it could be anyone, and ultimately what the role of news is in political life. We also see the emergence of casual and informal election surveys, usually in the form of your react button survey on Facebook, and more pervasively, usually those man on the street, or in Filipino, we call them Kalye survey, and it's quite prevalent in YouTube. So understandably, the surveys don't aim to look like your mainstream election polling, right, with rigorous methodologies. But they perform a kind of authenticity and intimacy by asking real people who they're voting for. And it's usually happening in many parts of the Philippines. What I think is objectionable in this kinds of content is that they claim a generalized political popularity of particular candidates, even if the survey is in no way representative of the real public pulse of people in that vicinity or area. Maybe one survey isn't gonna make a cut, it's just, somebody just asking their neighbors of who they're gonna vote for. But the thing with these kinds of, man on the street survey is that there are hundreds and even maybe now thousands of them on YouTube, and it could convince anyone that perhaps there's already a clear winner in the election that is, already deciding on the majority vote, even if it's not necessarily anyway specific, scientific or representative of people. Now, with that, the next finding I want to highlight is the increasing politicization of spaces and discourses online that are traditionally outside or detached from politics. So what happens here is that there's an obfuscation of political agenda the circulation of partisan content in non-political accounts, groups, and interactions. They are usually preying on unsuspecting users and audiences, and they evade being identified as part of political campaigning, even if there's a political agenda at play. In our data, there is the circulation of political content being shared from non-political pages, such as entertainment, features, sports, gaming, and meme pages. These are what we call as cloaked accounts because they cloak themselves in the generic conventions of the categories outside of news and politics. It's like a candy wrapper of sort, but they are in itself political in nature. And we find this manipulative because political campaigning should be obvious and distinguishable. That's why you need to label your ads as political ads. But the thing with this content is they package political content as something else, as a way to distance itself from formal political communication conventions and embed itself into cultural spaces where partisanship is unexpected and thus could be more potent in influencing voters. We also see the infiltration of political content within non-political interest groups, conceding that politics is a popular topic and is inevitably going to be a point of discussion anywhere in any group there is. What we see that is alarming here is that they're distancing the distancing of politics from the deliberative forms of democracy to narrow definition of political engagement based on group identity, binary truth claims, and hyperpartisanship. So what happens in this group is that for you to be, political, it's not only choosing a side. You're not, people are expected to choose a side even before the campaigning season actually started. But they are actually expected to support, defend, and even contribute to the political narrative of the camp they're supporting. And these political, feelings and affinities are stoked in contexts where it's not really conducive to engage in political discourse. So they're forced to engage politically by provoking them with political content in these non-political spaces. And now the last finding worth discussing, and we found a lot, and I think I'm just highlighting the things that could be present also in the rest of Asia, is that this information in tandem with platform manipulation transform itself into a self-sufficient machinery when cultivated within algorithmic communities. So one lie won't be dysfunctional to democracy, right? It can exist. It's part of a healthy, discourse or democratic process. But when it becomes a sophisticated web of lies fortified by multiple actors and legitimized by the algorithm through recommendations, through the things that is shown in the search result, groups of users are actually using this falsehood and distortion as anchors to how they interpret the rest of the social world. In a separate but related study of historical disinformation about Marcos Sr., the father of the candidate running in the Philippines, you see here how the pro-Marcos influencers are closely linked to each other such that they are being recommended from one video to the next. In later iteration, this is more akin to users searching for more information about the Marcoses. We see how the official and citizen-led Marcos affiliated channels also appear in the network. So what happens here is that the YouTube algorithm surrounds you with similar narratives about the Marcos regime, and ultimately they justify, the imposition of martial law in the Philippines during the dictatorship. They mystify, the ill-gotten wealth that the Marcoses purportedly amassed, and embellishing the alleged achievements of the Marcos government, and now the alleged achievements of the son of the dictator. Remember also, I mentioned the man on the street surveys earlier, together with other disinformation actors and sources like alternative news channels and hyperpartisan influencers. Now, they are engaging on their own, admittedly, because they've been using very stylistic and strategic engagement strategies. But the thing is, when they form, communities and clusters together, they are supercharged. Borderline is information narratives and tactics when consumed together with other, borderline disinformation strategies become really compelling political narratives, and they manufacture political popularity or favor that are quite hyperbolic and exaggerated compared to what we see in news media. So the return of investment of all of this is the cultivation of communities of users who, with enough, flaming and provocation, can be mobilized as the politicians' own advocates, their own brokers, and even campaigners for their campaign. Now, we have long documented this information operations online. Platforms are doing it, researchers are doing it, even journalists are doing it, right? But we need to ponder now as researchers of its implication to elections and democracy at large, and I offer a few thoughts. First, how this information has become so pervasive that it is not only a tool to amass political power, but it's already a norm for most politicians who want to compete for power. Even straight politicians, at least, how we perceive them to be, are advised to have this information infrastructures in their arsenal and campaigns. Not only because it is engaging, but also, if they don't engage in these kinds of activities, it leaves them in a precarious situation because they're often the target of this information. And if they don't fight back with the same tactics, they might, not recuperate in terms of their political careers. Second is that most disinformation efforts have been running for years. And once they have seeded and grew this alternative information ecosystem, the politicians who invested there actually gain exponentially from that investment. We see this in how Marcos Jr. capitalizes Duterte's disinformation agents and ecosystem and communities as well in this election. And we will later see how if he wins or not, even if he loses the election this year, we will see how this accumulation of this information infrastructure will actually be an asset later on, whether or not he's successful. An indicator we need to start measuring is not only the disinformation strategies and ecosystem out there, but more of the maturity of this ecosystem and how their persistence across time in fact normalizes and weaponizes a culture of impunity that might not be reversible anymore through democratic means. The last point is about the deteriorating state of our public sphere. So with the dwindling public trust and media trust, the rise of alternative influence network is quite inevitable, and they advance their own agenda by promoting a distorted political reality that divide and isolate people from engaging in meaningful political deliberation. If structurally our public sphere is already dysfunctional as it is, we can't expect to have a real political power from the public, and that we will forever have fragmented publics unable to arrive at the common ground. So I know this sounds depressing, at least in the Philippine context. I'm looking forward to hear from our colleagues also here what's happening in Hong Kong and South Korea. But ultimately, this information is just another political tool to win the election and to get political favor. But I urge everyone to shift our attention not really on the disinformation tactics out there, but to the political, economic, and cultural infrastructure that enable and support it to thrive. I'm talking about platform governance, about this information workers and the industry behind it, the money that runs this information work, populist politics, and other structural mechanisms that contribute and perpetuate this information. We need to investigate this underlying machinery to meaningfully engage, regulate, and eventually dismantle this industry that has grown to be a monster that seems to be we're unable to tame anytime soon. So that's for me for my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Fatima. Thanks for that presentation, and yeah, we'll get to ask her some questions during the discussion, which will happen after the three presentations. So thanks, Fatima. We'll now go to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Assistant Professor Stephanie Chang from Hong Kong Baptist University, Department of Communication Studies. She's also the director of HKBU Fact Check. Her research focuses on the psychology of media audiences, particularly the study of message effects and persuasion on digital media, and has also studied fake news and fact-checking during the pandemic. So without further ado, Stephanie.
Hi. So thank you for the introduction and thank you for the first presentation. Whenever I learn, more about, fake news, misinformation, disinformation in other contexts, it made me really feel that it's very context specific, right? So let's see. So today I'm going to kind of tap into election and fake news from the perspective of fact checking, right? So in Hong Kong, currently we have two IFCN signatories, Fact Check Lab and Andy Lab, and we also have AFP. They don't really register in Hong Kong, but they have some Hong Kong-based fact checkers, and also they publish, fact checkers about Hong Kong. And also we have FactWire and of course HKBU Fact Check, where I actually co-direct with another colleague. So on a daily basis, we work on finding suspicious content and to do verification, right? And we also, during this process, when I know that, I have to, well, I'm invited to this seminar, to this workshop, I asked my colleague, right, have we found any fake news or suspicious content related to the election, right? So this kind of made me engage to find out why there is so few fake news, right, about this matter. So of course, to figure out why, right, I try to find out, is it really that we're missing a lot of posts, right? So I went on to CrowdTangle. I look out for chief executive, right, election, and I try to figure out, well, what's happening, right, on Facebook. In Hong Kong, people mainly use Facebook for political discussions, right? Also, we mainly focus on Facebook for fake news detection. So you can see in the last few days, 30 days, in the blue box, we don't find too many posts, right? If there are posts, they're actually talking about we want to delay, right? The government want to delay the election to a later date due to the serious, severe COVID infection rate and the pandemic. Right? So I try to narrow down the search a little bit, and I found out, well, why don't we just focus on nomination, right? In Hong Kong, we're still in the process of nomination. So you can see just a few, we kind of cut down the posts by a lot, and you can see focusing on nomination, focusing on the election itself, but not the postpone of the election, we don't have a lot of content. Right, so it's kind of the nature of the election in Hong Kong, right? So what is so special about this election of the chief executive is the chief executive is actually elected by the election committee, right? And he or she will be appointed by the central people's government, right? So when we look deeper, it's basically a very, very I won't say very small, but it's 1,500 members, right? In Hong Kong who will be able to vote, right? And at this stage, even though the election is coming up, we still don't have a lot of information about who is going to be nominated, right? And what is the background, etc. Right? So therefore, because citizens have not gained too much information about it, right? And because it's not like a public election that everybody can engage or at least vote for the committee members, etc. This has been done in the past already, right? So focusing on the election committee, the public are not as engaged. I think in later on you'll hear about Korea, what happened just now, and what we had listened just now in the first presentation as well, right? So therefore, in this context, what we found was a lot of rumors, right? So for instance, so it's all in Chinese, but basically is talking about if, right? If they are, if the three women are interested in, in the election, who are you going to support, right? This is talking about, well, this lady here might be interested in being nominated to be in the election. So when we are coming up from the fact-checking perspective, right, these are all, I would say, in a future tense, right? And it's not really for us to do a lot of fact check unless we contact the person, but that would be very difficult as well. Later on, we'll elaborate on that as well. So with this future tense, right, everything is going to, people are just guessing, right, speculating. That means there are very little that as a fact checker, right, what we can do to pursue it. And second is availability of evidence, right? When we work on fact check or when we want to claim something as a piece of fake news, right? We do have to have evidence to prove it wrong or right? So in this process, it's really hard to contact, right, these people. And they might say yes or no today, right? Well, I'm not going to be in the nomination. I'm not going to be in the election, but maybe a week later, they might change their mind, right? So these kind of evidence is really hard to grasp, right? Even if you have some concrete evidence, we have tried that before, right? The source might change their mind, right? They might change the narrative, and therefore, usually we would avoid similar kind of contents. So this is just, I think, happened in these 2 days. Basically, another female might be nominated, but as you can see, if you know Chinese, right? Basically, when the reporter asked her, right, about her plan about the election or being nominated, she's like shutting down, right? She's not telling the reporting too much. So again, without concrete evidence, it's very hard to distinguish, right? Or to claim something as a piece of fake news or misinformation. And lastly, I think in relation to election, there are a lot of opinionated pieces, right? People might have different opinions, right? Different speculations. And again, right, if you have been in the fact-checking industry or you know a lot about fake news and the definition of misinformation, you will know it's very hard to debunk, right, a piece of opinion. Of course, there's literature that talk about, well, opinions actually are based on facts, right? Facts might, be very closely related to opinions as well. But in this case, many things, many information that's coming out as just doesn't fit our profile. Right? So when we work on fact checking and when we want to argue, right, a piece of information is a piece of fake news, we have to make sure the content is trackable, right? By trackable, it means we have to be, there's evidence to be found, right? And there are facts, right, to debunk. And also, there has to be any misleading and false content. I think there's no question about that, right? And we also look at whether it meets, public interest. Of course, election, right? It also meets public interest, widespread or not, right? So I think the question here, or kind of the issue here in relation to the election in Hong Kong that's coming up, is whether the content is trackable. So in fact, due to such a low volume of information circulating about the election, same as I think many other countries, we are actually focusing on the Russian war, right? And a lot of disinformation. And due to these kind of this information that flow into Hong Kong, kind of opens up our eyes. Because in Hong Kong, I think, as I said in the beginning, fake news is very context specific, right? We don't see that many these kind of photo manipulation, right, fabrication in Hong Kong in the past. But now we have been working on more, right, photo, visual, maybe video clips, right, manipulation due to the war that is happening right now. And second, throughout the process, of course, we have been working on COVID-19 as well, right? I think the pandemic, it's will stay with us for a while, whether it's another virus coming out or it's the policies that's coming out. So we are actually working hard to debunk those. So in general, same as what was presented in the first presentation is, they found politicalized content, right, and wrapped in an entertainment context. And in Hong Kong as well, no matter in whatever context, right, you can find political information, right, or opinions in different non-political groups as well. So of course, I would like to bring it up to talk about some, what we have in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, we have elections and we also have a lot of movements, right? I guess you guys are familiar with the umbrella movement, with the anti-extradition law movement, etc. So what we have been working on is looking at personal biases. Right. So what we have found is, people with different views, they are going to interpret the exact same piece of information to be fake to significantly different degrees. Right. So I think this might be applied to other contexts as well. Of course, if you have heard about other literature, for instance, Pennycook and Rand, right? They might think it suggests is laziness, maybe it's cognitive laziness, etc. So in the future, we are going to work on this to see if, at least in Hong Kong, right, what is the driving force for people to believe in fake news, or even it's not a piece of fake news, right? Why do you think they think it's fake? So in fact, yesterday, not yesterday, maybe a few hours ago, right, there was another talk by a professor in the University of Amsterdam. So they were arguing that, right, or calling for more research from a citizen's perspective. So I do agree on that call, is that we have to have more research, right, from the audience perspective. Right, because audiences are those who share information. I think Edson also had a piece talking about why people are motivated to share a piece of fake news, and because they are the kind of the media, right, to share, and they are kind of the goal of disinformation, right? So if a publisher or an author try to publish something fake, they actually want to influence their audiences, right? So to what extent and how are these audiences perceiving and processing this information? I think is very important. So previously, we also looked into the anti-extradition movement, and what we found was when people look at a piece of information, especially a piece of news information, they would try to estimate, try to guess actually what's behind it, right? They might try, okay, so what is this journalist or what is this publisher, what is the author trying to do, right? And such a perspective, such a estimation of attributions of motives can actually impact news evaluations. And in this article, we actually talk about, well, to what extent do these motives, right? If I think this journalist is coming up to influence people, right, or to defend the power, right, to defend the government, they would have, derive a different conclusion about the story they have just read, right? And again, of course, we also found the exact same finding that is, partisans, right? People with opposing views actually perceive the information in opposing ways. So talking about personal biases, we actually found that perhaps, right, fact checks, it's a very slow process. Everybody's critiquing it, right? Whenever there is a piece of information that's coming out today, perhaps a debunk, the fact-checking report might appear maybe 2 weeks later, right? Or even a month later, sometimes faster. If it's a simple photo manipulation, it might come up today or tonight. But that's really rare, right? It depends on the resources, etc., the context. And therefore, we are moving forward to invest more in media and information literacy, right? As I said, right, audiences, citizens, they are kind of encountering these and processing this information on a daily basis, right? So if we're fortunate enough to make them aware of the personal biases, of course, that's very difficult, or to make them to be more critical of those information that might be helpful. And again, right, by the trick is to make them more critical, but not forming distrust, right? So that's a different concept, and I think we have to be careful when we work on the interventions. So basically, that's it. Try to wrap up with personal biases and research on, a political context at the very end. So welcome any questions and discussions at the end.
Thank you. Thanks. If any of you have questions, you can type them down on in the Q&A box, or raise your hand, and we'll bring you into the panel discussion. I have a first question. My first question is addressed to Fatima, but the rest of the presenters can also answer. So I'm quite intrigued when Fatima, you talked about the propaganda as news, right? So it's not just fake news mimicking traditional news elements, right, to be deceptive, but you're saying that in the Philippines, propaganda, they're not even pretending to be traditional news, but they're presenting themselves to be like is it a new type or a new genre of news? My question is, do you think that the audiences are receptive? Do they consider these propaganda materials as newsworthy?
Yes, so I think we have to think about that strategy in particular as the second part of two punch strategy. First is really discrediting the media, right? So you don't need the media to get your news and information nowadays. In fact, we are here to provide you an alternative source of information. That's why they are priming the audience to believe that they too can deliver news, because they're saying that the news media has been fooling you all along. So that kind of anti-media rhetoric is in bundle or in tandem with that alternative offering of news, of propaganda's news. That's why they have the audacity to present themselves as news, because part of their claim is that the news that you consume is actually fake in the first place. So related to what was discussed earlier, there's existing belief that you have to seed first for those kinds of propaganda's news genre kind of content to be potent and to be receptive. And I think this is something that has been discussed in literature. The how they perform, I guess, newsness nowadays is really more authentic and derives from a lot of micro celebrity strategies. That's why in straight news that we see on television, it's just news, it's just factual, right? Here you have emotions, there's excitement, there's narrative. So there's also that performativity aspect that makes these kinds of propaganda's news content more compelling.
Thanks, Fatima. And it's I would say it's like a perfect formula, right? That on one hand, you are discrediting traditional news media. On the other, it seems like they're also picking certain practices. Being obviously partisan is not new. We've seen news organizations in other media contexts being very open with their political biases. So it's like they're mixing and matching different things, right, to be more compelling.
Yes. Essentially, it is I will use what works for me, and then I'll discard everything else that doesn't work for my agenda. So for us, I think it's there's still trust in the aesthetics of news. Whenever you see headline, whenever you see the banners in the video, you would have not even conscious, perhaps an unconscious association that that looks like news to me. And even if it's not news, using the aesthetic, the look of news makes us expect that it's news. No? So I think you're right, it's a mixed bag of things, and they leverage on the look of news but not really the content.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, I had a thought. Maybe it could be related to what Sungjung also mentioned, right? In terms of now, I'm also thinking what do people, whether when people consume news, right? When news from real sources, do they consume it because they want to be informed, or maybe they're using traditional news for something else, right? It may not be for information per se. Maybe they're keeping themselves informed from non-traditional sources, maybe from propaganda sources, right? But they still want to keep track of news, maybe for something else, maybe to find something that they can support their existing beliefs with, or maybe find something that they can attack, people who disagree with them, or maybe just to keep track of interesting. So I mean, this is just very thought provoking. Maybe some people are watching the news to confirm their beliefs that the news is biased. Okay, I'm seeing this. This is different from what my other sources on YouTube are saying, and it fortifies, right, my lack of trust in certain traditional news sources. But so thanks, Fatima. I know that. So Swati has raised her hand, but let me just go to Andy. I know Andy has a question. I'm going to bring him into the discussion. So Andy, if you want to ask your question, I know you type a question for Stephanie. So Andy, are you there? Okay, let me just make sure that I was able.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
I made it.
Hi, Andy.
I made it. Hi. Okay. Hey, great presentations, everyone. Thank you. It's been really interesting. So my question was for Stephanie, and it was relatively early in your presentation. You said that we always need to have evidence to refute a claim, and I was wondering, what are the implications of that for fake news and fighting fake news? And here in the U.S., we always talk about the burden of proof, right? Because it's built into the legal system that the burden of proof for a claim always is on the plaintiff, the person making the claim. The defender doesn't have to prove anything. In fact, a common defense is just to say, well, can you prove that happened beyond a reasonable doubt? So this kind of flips that. This suggests if you always need evidence, it suggests that the burden of proof now kind of falls on the defender of truth, so to speak, for a fact checker. So I was just curious as to what you thought about that in terms of fake news, and what are some of the implications, maybe some research that is called for, if this is true.
So, thank you for a question. I think that's a very good question. Yes, I think the burden of proof is kind of on the defender side, right? If we look at the IFCN principles and codes of principles, we have to have proof, right? And in our experience, when we select a suspicious content, and we have to decide whether we're going to work on it or not, right? Whether we're going to invest our time and resources into it, we have to look for evidence first, right? Can we get any evidence? If no, we might have to hold it or skip it. And sometimes, even if we get some evidence, right, and we're not sure, we also have to hold and drop it. I think that is kind of following the codes of principles, and also to make sure we are not another fake news disseminator, right? So if we're not sure, we will kind of hold it on our end. And what is more difficult is sometimes if someone say A says something, right, and we just can't rely on A, right? We can't just go back to the original author of the claim and ask him or her, right, about whether this is right or correct, right or wrong. We have to have extra proof, right? We have to have perhaps a secondary source or etc., right, to prove it. So it's not, basically it's not easy, right? And therefore, I think the implications is, I think researchers have to learn about the limits of fake news, right? I think why it is so important is people just take what is fake news, right? If you look into the literature, look into the current research, people, for instance, in an experiment, they would like to expose participants to some fake news, and where would they go? Right? They would go directly to these fact-checking sites. They would extract these fake news and expose them, right? And work on them, experiment, etc. And if we look for fake news, right? If we just want to look at the count of fake news, what is being disseminated, circulated in a particular region, researchers again, right? They will jump into these fact-checking sites and say, okay, we have this type of fake news, that type of fake news. But given that we know the limitations of fact-checking, right? Today we're just focusing on evidence, right? There are other limitations, right? Focusing on whether we can get sufficient proof and evidence, we can already see, right? What is being fact-checked doesn't really equate to this fake news in general, right? Or fake news present in a society. And to elaborate more, and according to our observation, sometimes citizens or some KOLs, they might try to evade this as well, right? If they don't have any evidence, but they want to, manipulate, or they want to just voice out their opinion, they might say, well, I have heard about this, right? It's just a rumor, but, I would like to share about it, right? And sometimes they might put out a claim, put out an argument, and they might, quote unquote, right, not fact check yet, right? So how can fact checkers, right, work with these scenarios? And I think in general, again, is that researchers have to understand the dynamics, the mechanism in the fact-checking process, is also audiences, right? They are learning from how we do fact checks, and they are adapting, right, as to how they can avoid, right, the being fact-checked, right, but to also speak freely about their opinions or about their thoughts. So I think in general, I think it's a very good question. We are also currently thinking about this as well, right? But in general is, according to, we being fact checkers, there are a lot of restrictions, right, I would say, or rules or laws, or not really laws, or rules that we should abide to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. So Andy is also an assistant professor at the Weekly School. Thanks for that question. I mean, I also thought about it, and Andy, right? I mean, I think part of this is most humans are still operating from what the truth default theory argues, that the default belief is, if we're presented with a claim, we think it's true, right? And in a way, that the implication of that is it puts the burden on those who are accusing someone to be untruthful, right? Which I agree is unfortunate, right? So I think if we want to reverse that, we need to, how do we reverse that default mindset? That the default mindset would be that this may not be true until it's proven true, right? So I guess it's human nature. I guess it's unfair, but I think I like what Stephanie said earlier, that you also don't want people to then not trust anything anymore, right? Because societies are built on trust. So you want people to be critical, but not skeptic, I guess, right? So yeah, it's like what Stephanie said, ongoing research, right? So thanks Andy, thanks Stephanie. We have time for maybe 2 more questions. I see that Swati raised her hand. So Swati, I'm going to bring you into the discussion, into the panel, so you can maybe let us know your comment or your question. Swati, yeah, let's see whether you can Turn your
Yes.
camera on. There you go. Hi, Swati.
Hi, Fatima. Thanks very much for that presentation, and it was very interesting. And I would love to know more actually about your research, because I see very interesting parallels with what's happening in India. This sort of sophisticated, almost what seems like an invulnerable disinformation ecosystem that's been erected and created in India. In fact, so much so that the second wave of COVID seems to where I mean, I'm sure world news covered it. So the fact that there were so many deaths and the health infrastructure sort of collapsed, etc., it almost seems as if none of reality could puncture there's this sort of sophisticated disinformation ecosystem. So I think you did not cover this, and you may not have covered it, but I'd just be curious to know, what happens to this disinformation ecosystem when, and we know that news consumption from traditional news sources did go up during the pandemic. So what happens when when you do see, suffering and deaths, and I know Philippines had its fair share, that collides with, that interacts with this propaganda as news system. So then you're actually seeing, did consumption from traditional news sources go up? And if you're seeing both together, any thoughts on how this might, this sort of interacted there in Philippines? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mati, for that question. I think the situation is going to be different for health news or pandemic-related news with politics. Definitely, I agree. I don't have the data right now, but definitely during the time where there's a lot of uncertainty, news consumption would definitely go up. But the thing is, since the pandemic is never ending, there's fatigue already with what kinds of pandemic news am I gonna read? In fact, I would argue logically that it could be that people are veering away from news anymore, and they're not anymore watching pandemic-related content because it is stressing them out. It is causing anxiety or whatnot. So if there's not if there's a need to know pandemic news, they're gonna watch it from traditional news sources. But definitely, politics is a different context. I think for the pandemic, there's real life experiences or reality, as you said, that could support what they're watching on television or in print media. But for politics, it's almost all anecdotal, right? If for instance, in the Philippines, what's happening right now, there's a lot of like big political rallies for the candidates. And what's happening is that the other camp would say, oh, only a few attended the rally. Here's some evidence. People saw on the ground what's happening. And it's the same claim for the other camp, right? And if you're not there, it's really hard to verify that. There's a recent news, and some might know this, that there are photos that being photoshopped to show like crowds of people in one of the candidates' rallies, but it's actually a photo from an Indonesian event. But then again, you're not there to verify. So how could you possibly overlap with your experiences, a phenomenological approach to research or to reality, and the claims of the rallies being well attended? So there's that discrepancy in real life experience, and that is a basis for you to claim it's true, and the claims of the politicians. So I think in relation to what Stephanie mentioned earlier, I think really tying back to what I said about the infrastructure, there's a lot of incentive to lie, but not a lot of disincentive to to avoid lying or to not do it in the first place. So if the infrastructure, if there's risk involved, it's going to be minimal. I'm just gonna lie outright about it. So I think that's the reality right now. Even if fact checkers are doing their jobs in addressing these lies, the thing is that even within our audiences now, a lot of people don't subscribe to the news fact checking system to begin with. It's only receptive to people who are open minded, but those who might be closed off already with the biases that Sunjong discussed earlier, that might be a more difficult battle to win.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating. Thanks, Swati. Thanks, Thanks, Fatima. And yeah, so I'm going to ask the final question. I have a question for Sungjong. But before that, I'm also thinking, we're seeing this in the Philippines, probably in other media systems too, where some people are sharing things that are obviously fake. Probably sharing a photo from somewhere to say that this happened in a particular event, and they know that it's not true, right? But they still share it. And I would suspect others, like what Sung Jung said, others might be sharing, forwarding the same images, even they know that it's not true, but maybe because it's consistent with what they want to be true, right? So, that's why I'm going to Sung Jung now. And asking that question, you found this potential, this effect, right? That people may be maybe espousing certain beliefs that they themselves do not necessarily believe in. But you found this in South Korea, in the experiment, the national survey and experiment you did there, but not in the U.S. Is there any? To what, like Fatima said, infrastructure or contextual differences that you think might account for why this effect was observed in South Korea but not in the previous elections in the US?
Yeah, I think that, thank you for asking this great question. Well, I think that it's early to tell whether this is driven by some sort of differences based on macro kind of infrastructure about the political information. And at the same time, it is not driven by country. Actually, it's driven by that particular misinformation itself. So we need to investigate further about what is the unique characteristics of this misinformation. But one of the things that I can share is, interestingly, when you look at the source of information they look at for those people who mistakenly claim this, on both countries, they have sufficient exposure to this information from the legacy media. So based on the traditional source of media, they basically identify themselves that, well, I'm pretty much well informed. I kept following this kind of information. That's the reason why they answer to the question that, well, I heard about this before, and that I endorse it, or I, basically don't believe that is the case. The other thing that I wanted to share, or something that is unique from the case of US, one of the correlational kind of variable correlation that we found from the people who endorse these mistaken beliefs and who actually believe in it, they have a greater tendency to engender racism. So when we measure about the modern racism scale, those are the people who score high on the modern racism scale as their kind of a background variables of this population who actually endorse the fake news and at the same time who trust it and who believe in it actually internally. So that is the thing that I can share as of now. But as of now, it's too early to tell whether there's a differences because of this, infrastructure of political information, or is it driven by individual factors of the people? Because it requires additional data to tease that out. But that could be an interesting investigation that we can further pursue. So thank you for asking this great question.
Thanks, Sung Jong. I have more questions to all three of you, but I also want us to have lunch because it's already past noon. So thank you very much, Stephanie, Fatima, and Sung Jong, for your excellent presentations, very thought-provoking presentations. And thank you to all of those who attended today's webinar. I hope we can continue this conversation in other platforms, maybe in another webinar after you've continued and did do more data gathering. And yeah, we would love to hear more about this. And hopefully the next time we speak, we'll be talking about, I would say, more positive news, right? Maybe some improvement, in how the public responds to fake news and how they respond to fact checks. So thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of the afternoon, and hope to see you in other events or in other ways of collaborating. Thank you. Bye-bye.